Hello, welcome everybody. My name's Alex Vitale. I'm professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project, which is hosting today's briefing. This is the third in a series of briefings we've been holding to try to influence important public safety policy conversations in the context of the new Mamdani administration here in New York City. But I think these ideas have broader applicability. Our first briefing was on mental health crisis teams. The second briefing was on sex work issues. This third briefing on Sentinel event reviews. And our fourth briefing will be in April. It will be about gang suppression policing issues. And that briefing will have Obia Friye from LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, Babe Howell from CUNY Law School, and Erica Ford, who runs Life Camp, which is part of New York City's crisis management system of community-based violence intervention groups. So if you're not already on our mailing list, be sure to sign up on our Substack. We'll put a link in the chat, and we have a great lineup for you today. So we're going to hear today from John Hollway, who is Senior Advisor at the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at the University of Pennsylvania. Paige Valenta and Matt Tye, both Assistant Chiefs in the Madison, Wisconsin Police Department. Karin Martin at the University of Washington. And Muir, former Executive Director of the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland, and also formerly at the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. So we're going to hear from the presenters. I'm going to have a few questions from them. If there's time, we'll get a chance to hear from a few others. We are taping today's session, which will be available afterwards. We'll put it out in our newsletter, etc. So again, thank you for joining us. And John, we've still got a bunch of people coming in, but John, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Alex. I really appreciate your putting this together. It's great to have an opportunity to talk about the Sentinel event review process and how it might be useful for the people of New York. And I really want to thank Paige, Matt, and Karin, who have participated in event reviews that we've done before, and I'll let them share their stories about that. But I'm really grateful to them for taking time out of their important work to come help present this. The Quattrone Center, which is where I work, is at the University of Pennsylvania Law School in Philadelphia. And we started in 2013, and our kind of approach is, to put it in one sentence, we embrace what we call a systems approach to preventing errors in criminal justice. So QC stands for Quattrone Center. It also could stand for quality control, and we're trying to elevate the quality of the criminal justice system. And when we talk about a systems approach to preventing errors, what we mean is we don't represent clients, even though we're at a law school. We don't participate in litigation. We try to look at the criminal justice system and then work with jurisdictions in ways that will enhance what they're doing and eliminate errors. And if you're thinking about a system, an error is anything that a system is not supposed to generate or that we don't want to generate. So an undesired or unintended outcome is an error in criminal justice, and we would define that for purposes of this conversation. I would say that wrongful convictions or officer-involved shootings or deaths of individuals in state custody all are easily, I think we can all agree those are errors. Those are outcomes we don't want our system to generate. And I think that's true whether you're a police officer or not a police officer. Those are not things that police or prosecutors want to be involved with. They're not things we want to see in the community. And so the question that the Quattrone Center asks is, if nobody wants those things to happen, why do they happen anyway? And I think, unfortunately, all three of those categories, officer-involved shootings and uses of force, wrongful convictions and deaths in custody, all happen more often than we would like. What we asked at the Quattrone Center was, what can we do to prevent those? And we have existing procedures and policies that are designed to address these errors when they happen. We've got internal affairs investigations, we've got disciplinary review boards. Mac, you're on a civilian complaint review board, and those are obviously important and valuable things too. And all of those things deliver what I would call backwards-looking accountability, right? In the criminal justice system, we administer blame all day, every day. It's kind of what we do, and so it's not entirely surprising that the tools that we have for addressing a wrong are blame-focused. And what we do is we look backwards and we say, who deviated from a protocol, who did something wrong, and how should they be held accountable? And I think in a situation where that can be important, right? We need to make sure we redress past wrongs. But what the Quattrone Center did was look at other complex human systems like transportation and aviation, places that are hardworking people in complex dynamic situations, operating with imperfect information in situations where people's lives are at stake. And if I use that description, you might say, well, am I talking about criminal justice, healthcare, or transportation? And the answer is, of course, all three. And so we asked the question basically like to say, okay, so why don't we look at errors in criminal justice the same way that the National Transportation Safety Bureau looks at a plane crash, or the way that a hospital would deal with a surgical error? And what those organizations do is they have all of the litigation and all of the internal reviews. They've got all the backwards looking accountability, but they do something in addition to that to reduce errors over time. They don't just look to redress a past wrong, they look to prevent that thing from happening again. And that forward-looking accountability, that obligation to improve over time and reduce errors over time, is something that we don't really do in criminal justice very often. And the system that they use is called Sentinel event reviews. So maybe the simplest way for me to explain what we're doing in a Sentinel event review, and I'm going to apologize in advance for using a sports metaphor, but I want to talk about what happens in the National Football League when there's been an interception, okay? And so I'm going to use an interception as my Sentinel event review in football. So in Philadelphia, we've got a quarterback named Jalen Hurts, and he may or may not be the most popular quarterback out there, but we're in New York. We can use Jackson Dart if we want to use him. Let's take our NFL quarterback and let's start by assuming talent, training, and good faith. And this is what we do in healthcare and in transportation, and what we do in our Sentinel event reviews in criminal justice is we start by assuming that whether you like Jalen Hurts or Jackson Dart or not, you've got to believe they're one of the 30 best people in the world at what they do, and they're going to go out and run a play that they've been trained to do. The training has given them lots of options of how to do things, lots of discretion, and if one thing doesn't work, they've got backup options, and the team goes out and they know exactly how they're going to run this play. And then the ball gets hiked and all hell breaks loose. And 22 men are running around that field, and people are falling down, and people are doing unexpected things. And our quarterback is running around trying to figure out second by second how to adjust to this ever-changing situation and get the best outcome he can get for his team. And in this situation, most of the time these plays work really well. Everything goes according to plan because they're good at what they do. This instance, something goes wrong and we've got an interception, okay? This is our Sentinel event. And the interception could be an officer-involved shooting. It could be a wrongful conviction. It could be a death in custody. It could be a use of force. It could be the George Floyd protests, which Matt and Paige and Karin will talk about. This is our unwanted outcome, and we need to figure out why this happened and prevent it. Now, my buddies and me, we've been tailgating. We're up in the cheap seats, and we know the problem. The problem is Jalen Hurts is a bum, and we should fire him. We should get rid of him. But that's not what the Eagles do. That's not what the Giants do. They come back because they know how complicated this is, and they do a video review as a team. And they review going right back to the very, very beginning of the situation, and they say second by second, and they ask the question, what did you see? Why did you do the things you did? Why did you think these were the things that would get you your best outcome? And then maybe if somebody does something deliberately bad, maybe we do something, but most of the time, everybody's trying to get the right result on the play, and we need to redesign the play to help our teammates get better results. And that's really what a Sentinel event review is designed to do. We go into a jurisdiction where there's been an error, one of these errors that we talk about, and we gather the police and the other 8 professionals who participated in the review, and we gather community members who can explain their perspectives on the review, and we ask the question, what did you see? Why did you think these were the things that were going to get you to a peaceful, safe resolution of this, and where did we depart from that? And when you start from that premise, when you start from that, let's assume good faith, let's not assume blame to start. Let's assume we've got well-trained, well-intended people. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, I hope I get involved in an officer-involved shooting. And that's true of the police officer, and it's certainly true of anybody on the other end of that. And so if nobody wanted it to happen, let's go back to the beginning, let's go through your day, and let's figure out where our event departed from what normally happens. And then let's work together to come up with upstream changes that would have prevented us from ever getting there. And when we look at these things, we always find it's never just one thing that happened. It's lots of little things that come together in unexpected ways to lead to our bad outcome. And so when I'm going to turn it over in just a minute to Paige and Matt and Karin, the Quattrone Center, after the murder of George Floyd, was asked by 2 cities, Madison, Wisconsin, and Seattle, Washington, to come and work with them, because in each of those cities there were prolonged civil disruptions, protests, uses of force both by and against police, and property damage that happened for months after the murder of George Floyd. And in both situations, the police departments and the communities wanted to figure out what they could learn from this so that going forward we could have appropriate protests, appropriate uses of First Amendment freedoms that didn't escalate into uses of force and property damage. And so we sat down with Paige and Matt were obviously police representatives in the Madison review. Karin was a community representative in the Seattle review. And we sat down and had a structured process of conversation where everybody could really talk to one another. We could closely look at these events. In Madison, we looked at 14 different critical incidents, and we had audio and video, and we interviewed officers and really understood, just as you would have in that football context, why people did what they did moment to moment and how those things combined to escalate into unwanted uses of force. Those 14 critical incidents came up with 133 contributing factors. Okay, 133 different things that all came together to cause these 14 incidents of uses of force. And with the consensus of community and police participation, we actually came up with 69 recommendations for change. And those recommendations for change were consensus created and designed by community and police together, which meant that Paige and Matt and their colleagues were actually able to implement almost all of them, and wanted to, because they'd agreed that it would be useful to elevate how they do policing. So you get a process where the community feels heard, the community and police understand each other a lot better, and because the police are a willing and voluntary participant in the reviews, you're much more likely to get the reforms actually implemented. So we had a similar result in Seattle, where we kind of broke the months that they had of civil disruption into 4 phases. There we had 139 contributing factors and 136 recommendations for change. And each of those changes goes to make it less likely that protests will evolve into uses of force, property damage, etc. So I'm going to let the participants talk about their experiences so that the people who are on the Zoom really get what it's like to be part of it. But that's the nutshell of this, is a non-blaming orientation to say, how do we, people are going to make mistakes, these are difficult jobs, how do we make it easier for them to get the outcomes that we all want as a community? I think we've done this in a whole host of different environments over the course of the past decade, and we've evolved the process to a place where I think it's in a pretty good place. We'd love to share that knowledge and share that experience with the people of New York. And I just want to say, I want to close with one thing, which is, it's pretty common when I give this pitch for somebody to say, well, okay, but don't people deliberately act poorly in criminal justice in ways that they don't in healthcare and in transportation? And I would say that we have an adversarial system that sometimes people can do things we wish they wouldn't do in the criminal justice system. Our research suggests that intentional misconduct is less frequent than a lot of people think. But what I would say is this opportunity, when you start with good faith, you may learn that somebody has acted inappropriately, and we still have all those other disciplinary measures that we've always had to deal with that. So this is something that goes along with all of our traditional accountability measures, but all those accountability measures aren't trying to prevent this from recurring again. And if you look at, for example, officer-involved fatalities in the United States over the past decade, as tracked by the Washington Post, that line has basically been flat. And if you look at airline safety over time, what you see are fewer and fewer incidents and more flights. And the reason is airlines use Sentinel event reviews in addition to those discipline measures. We don't in criminal justice. And so we're not going to fire our way out of these problems. We've got to change the environment in which our people are working and improve their safety. So that's really what we're trying to do. Thanks for the opportunity to be on the soapbox here a little bit, Alex, and I'll turn it back to you for the rest of the group to share their experiences.
Thanks, John. That was a great way to get us started in the conversation. So, Matt and Paige, which of you would like to go first to talk a little bit about your experiences there in Madison with this?
Well, I can jump in, and I'm sure Matt will have additional things to add. I think the important thing to stress, and John already touched upon this, is that this is a non-adversarial process. And as he pointed out, that is relatively unique to a lot of the environments that the police department operates in, or police officers, whether it's the criminal justice system, it's adversarial. Whether it's PSNIA, that's also, sustained, unsustained. Is it criminal proceedings? Someone wins and someone loses. And so I think it is a unique perspective for criminal justice agencies and law enforcement to operate within that retrospective, non-blaming environment. I think that it's incredibly important to sit down and try to come to consensus recommendations about a highly impactful and emotional event. And it's really hard work. It was really challenging. It took a lot of hours, but we were able to accomplish those consensus recommendations. And I think that was incredibly important. I know that Matt and I learned a lot during the process. And I think we also deepened our relationship with some stakeholders in our community, where we all recognize that it's impossible, or that is possible, for the same people to sit and view event and come to completely different conclusions, and to have those discussions in a non-blaming environment, and in an environment that encourages safety amongst those people participating in the conversation is really a beneficial thing that we took away. Matt?
Yeah, I think that certainly resonates with what my experience was. And I think that the thing I would point out to anybody considering going down this path is it's just really crucial to set the tone for the room. And I think John and his team really did an excellent job of that. And as Paige highlighted, we were in a group with community stakeholders and other law enforcement and governmental officials for a long time. I mean, it took a long time to hash through all of this material, but we really went at it from a perspective of being open-minded, listening with this collaborative approach. And it's all rooted, as Paige suggested, in this non-adversarial process, which is something that we're really not used to in policing. We are very used to adversarial system, whether it's the criminal justice system, PSNIA, professional standards, internal investigations. And I think Paige articulated too, that was one of the things that was helpful in messaging this out to both the community and law enforcement, is that this was a collaborative process. And that's just so key. And I think that's a lot of what we learned and have taken forward. I mean, this was, 5 years ago or so that we that we underwent this process, but those relationships that were forged during the Sentinel event review process have maintained and have strengthened and have allowed us to continue to move forward, with this consensus type model. So I think it's just was really valuable and changing experience for me, certainly.
Thanks. Okay, so why don't we hear a little bit from Karin, who was coming from the community perspective in a review in Seattle.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. So yeah, definitely coming from the community perspective in the sense that I'm not a member of SPD, Seattle Police Department, but I'm also an academic professor at University of Washington who studies the criminal legal system. So I kind of came at it with those two lenses. And I think something that really stood out to me about the SER was the diversity of the participants. So not only was it just broadly speaking SPD plus community members, but it was people from every rank in SPD, so up to assistant chief and sometimes the chief would show up. So a lot of people were there across ranks. And in the community, there was business owners, but there were also just residents, there was activists, there was me, the academic. So there was a lot of diversity within those two sides. So I wouldn't just think it's like totally bifurcated, just SPD, just community. Within that, there's a lot of diversity. So that stood out to me as something that's pretty unique in terms of you don't really see that very often. Another thing I will say is that it did take a long time. So yeah, buckle up for quite a ride. But it was great. There's a lot of bonding that happened. The other thing that stood out to me is that in the criminal legal system, we often talk about accountability that drives a lot. So I've studied the courts and attorneys and judges a lot, very driven by accountability. Policing, obviously very driven by accountability. But then the community side, also quite concerned with accountability. But I think sometimes we're using that word and meaning different things. And what I saw in the SER was that there's actually a convergence of what accountability looks like and what that actually means to different stakeholders. And that is one of the reasons why it took a long time, is because people needed to kind of flesh that out. And so to underscore what John said about it being forward looking and not backwards looking, accountability in this process did become, yes, acknowledging the history and understanding the history, and that's what brought you there, a specific event, but really thinking about like instilling accountability in a structural sense moving forward in a way that actually resonated with everybody there. And to me, that is where the real power of this process lies, is in the fact that we are not just thinking like who did wrong things in the past, but like how can we as a actual fully emerged community come together and provide for accountability in the future. So that really stood out to me. The other thing I'll say is that there's, because of that diversity of who is there, there's like actual accountability in the sense that there's direct communication between stakeholders that's not mediated by the media and not mediated by unions and is not mediated by lawyers. There's a direct communication that is very rare to find. So a lot of other ways that we talk about accountability, it's mediated by people who are not directly impacted, and this allows for direct communication between people participating in events, influenced by events, affected by events, and people who are like there, right? So in the SCRs that I've been a part of, like actual officers who have been on video doing things that people see as problematic, or actual protesters who are on video doing things that are problematic, are in the room together talking about like what happened. And so it is not kind of a performative artificial, like in general, it would be great if people did these things or people didn't do those things. It's actually like coming together, like how can we really truly understand what happened and how can we prevent bad things from happening? One more thing I'll say is that the shift from blaming to understanding, I think actually I'm in the public policy school, so I literally study public policy. That shift from blaming to understanding, I think, is actually key to effective policy making. So again, it's another way of making accountability kind of structural, by thinking about understanding and not just blaming, which is the criminal legal system is set up to do quite well, and shifting that to policy and how can we move forward is another really powerful thing. So I'll end there so we have time for other people. Thanks.
Thanks, Karin. Mac, let's turn it over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Really struck by the conversations that are taking place there, but also thinking about my own work in civilian oversight. One of the main challenges that I saw first as an investigator and then a supervisor and a director of one of these organizations is that when an officer is exonerated in an internal investigation, the conversation tends to end there. And I want to ground this in New York City, where I was an investigator and supervisor for 7 years at the CCRB with a man named Michael Hansford, who was killed by members of the NYPD in 2018. Mr. Hansford was a bike messenger in his neighborhood, well known by everyone on the block, and he was evicted by his landlord and had an apparent serious mental health crisis. During that time, he grabbed a knife and chased his landlord down the street. Now, I was the investigator on that case, and this was in the New York Times, and it was a big deal because the officer shot him dead. But throughout the internal investigation, we found all of these issues that had occurred. For example, the officer had been in a car crash on the way over. They were both under the age of 24. They had received limited training as it related to mental health issues, and there were a series of other communication issues that happened throughout this incident. I interviewed the officers, I interviewed the witnesses, interviewed the family members, etc. And I sat with the officers who were distraught, clearly wearing the burden of having killed someone right on their chests. Interviewed the family members who were distraught and had all this information about how this could have possibly been prevented. And wrote up a report that exonerated the officers. They received a letter that they weren't going to be disciplined for their actions, and that was the end of the conversation. And that tends to be how civilian oversight works in New York City right now. There is an investigation after investigation after investigation into misconduct. It's a yes or no pile for is there misconduct, and we are not compiling the lessons learned. And I think that what's really valuable about the CCRB in particular is that it is a place where there's a tremendous internal knowledge about what took place, officers providing not just justifications for their actions in a legal sense, but also their thought processes, the training that supported that. And we're not expanding on that. So that's what's so appealing to me about this process. I'm a huge fan of NTSB because that looks like a meaningful vision for actually fixing problems moving forward. In contrast to that sort of never-ending yes or no pile that ends with a recommendation to the NYPD commissioner, when I was out as executive director of the Community Police Review Agency in Oakland, we had two things that I think are really critical. One, we had disciplinary power, which is unique among civilian oversight agencies. But when we were exercising that disciplinary power, we had hearings with the leadership in the police department, the city attorney's office, the inspector general, the federal monitor, and other stakeholders, where we would talk through what had occurred during an investigation. And what resonates for me about those processes is they somewhat resembled this. Of course, they were at times disciplinary, but throughout the Oakland process, there were opportunities for us to say, okay, in the middle of this investigation, an officer said that this is how they were trained on Fourth Amendment issues. And Chief, what's it going to take for us to get all the officers retrained on this new case law, or all the officers to understand they can't frisk people under certain circumstances? Does anyone have issues with that? Are there questions? Let's collaboratively decide who is going to do that training, how it's going to be done, and let's have somebody from oversight present. So it was a glimmer of an opportunity to actually proactively address these issues. Of course, there were disciplinary findings and there were terminations in the midst of that, but I think that dovetails with what's going on in New York and the opportunity to integrate this in a meaningful way. So you have the NYPD Inspector General's office, which was designed to be relatively independent of the police department, but a potential facilitator for conversations like these. And I think for anyone who's paying attention to New York City politics and the NYPD, there should be a vision for how could we have these in a meaningful way and a discourse that would feel transparent to the community. I think that's the challenge with the NYPD in particular, is there are certainly sentiments that it is an insular organization. And what was very powerful for me about the Oakland experience is we could have these conversations, and I could go back to the community and say, hey, we were doing an investigation. We made sure our officers were retrained on X. We are going to be involved in those trainings. We're trying to create a better circumstance. Go talk to the chief about it. So there was some feedback loop. And as we move forward in New York, I think there needs to be a re-envisioning of what civilian oversight is, so that it more effectively reflects something that's trying to fix the problems as opposed to just document them.
Great, thank you. So I have a few questions for folks. Let me start with John. A number of people have mentioned that this is not a substitute for the possibility of administrative discipline or even criminal proceedings, but can you give us a little more detail about how that works? Do you have to wait to have the Sentinel event review until after those processes have played out? And what's the effect of the timing of all that on the process?
Sure. So first of all, let me make sure I'm being fair about an assertion because Paige, Matt, and Karin all talked about the dramatic amount of time that we spent together, and we did. But I want to be fair. We were looking at 3 months worth of hundreds of hours of videos and things to do that. A scenario like the one that Mac described is a much faster process, especially if you've gone through the initial work of building the relationships and setting up the review team. Once you've done that, an individual event like the kind that Mac described is something that can be done, I think, relatively quickly, and it just gets more efficient as the group gets more familiar with how the process works. So I don't want to take anything away from the insane effort that Paige, Matt, and Karin put into our processes, but I do want to differentiate 3 months of protests from an individual officer-involved fatality, for example. So with that as preface, let me answer the question that you've asked. So, we've seen this done in both ways. We've done this in a variety of different contexts, and one of the things that often happens is people are concerned that the event review is going to be used in subsequent litigation against the city, for example. Now, there are in Madison and in Seattle. By the way, Seattle was run by their inspector general, so to the extent that this is a process that would be housed in the New York inspector general, there may be an analogy there, or some learnings that we can get from Seattle and Lisa Judge, their inspector general. But in those contexts, the leaders of that city said, look, we need to learn from this, and the only thing worse than these tragedies that we've gone through would be not learning from them or waiting to learn from them. And so we're going to do those, and lawsuits are going to be lawsuits. People are going to sue, and people can get access to the information one way or another. So we're going to have our reviews. We're going to, depending on the rules of confidentiality, those may or may not be discoverable, but they probably are. And then that's going to be that. We've been in other jurisdictions where people have said, we want the litigation to flow and be complete before we engage. So let's assume that takes, I'm making this number up, 5 years, right? That would mean that in a New York context, what we would do is we'd say, well, let's go back and find cases where the litigation is done, but we had the outcomes we didn't want, and let's start by reviewing those. And there's plenty of those, and we've done event reviews that go back as far as 15 years, and we've still gotten learnings from them because the wheels of criminal justice reform turn really slowly. So it's kind of up to the jurisdiction whether you wait for litigation or not. I think Madison and Seattle and Tucson, where we haven't waited, those jurisdictions are very brave, but I think also very practical, because you're immediately saying to the community, we aren't going to let this go without learning from it. We're going to get better over time, and we're dedicated to that process. But if litigation does slow you down, we've got a big database of cases we can go look for and find things to learn from. So there's definitely those opportunities either way. Paige and Matt, I don't know, as being with the department, if you guys had those conversations and how you resolved them to move ahead.
Well, I think in our case, there was some bravery involved. And John, you did a great job of explaining kind of the matrix that you operate within, right? You can wait and have some deterioration of the benefit of something like this, and the results being, something that occurs really in the distant future. Or you can embrace the fact that litigation, if it is intended, and it's going to come either way. So I think that is an important consideration to keep in front of mind. I know also in our particular set of circumstances, we had, shall I say, the benefit of examining multiple incidents across multiple months, where the discussion revolved around the decision making of the higher command staff in terms of how these events played out, and if there were opportunities to change the course or path of events as they occurred. And so I think thinking about the particular type of event that's chosen for a review like this can offer different potentials and different levels of comfort with how the review might move in the future.
Yeah, I would just say we certainly had conversations. I think there was some just in the balance of because it was this very it was just such a difficult time for the community for such a long, sustained protest. I think we had 180 straight days of protests, and we just felt like we owed it to the community to do something, and so that outweighed any of the risks for potential litigation. But again, as John articulated, I think that's very different in a singular officer-involved shooting, and I think you could also go back and look at other officer-involved shootings as well. And so I think that's a different set of circumstances, but we definitely had those conversations.
Yeah, and Alex, I can't prove this, but I mean, I've always believed that part of the reason that we had those protests the way we did is that we haven't done Sentinel event reviews for the, all of these things that just keep happening and happening and happening and happening over decades. So I think that my personal belief, and obviously, I'm pro review, but my personal belief is the failure to embrace that forward-looking accountability really hurts your credibility as a government agency with the community, and it makes the job harder for Paige and Matt and all their folks to then go out and have to shoulder that burden.
But let me just follow up, because that was super helpful in terms of potential litigation against the city. But what about internal administrative disciplinary processes for officers?
Well, again, I guess I'll give my view, and then I'll turn to the experts who wear the badge and have to deal with that. But I guess my view is, again, these can be parallel processes, and we can work out how to handle that in ways that are both as transparent as we can get for the community and safe for the officers. I was struck by Mac's and kind of grateful, Mac, that your process understood that those officers were suffering too. When we do these reviews, it's very clear that the participants are wearing traumatic events as well, and making sure we have a process that cares for all parties is necessary. A lot of the times we'll do interviews and people will, we interviewed with the union's permission in Madison. I think we interviewed 65 police officers, and they were eager to explain their side of the story, which they didn't feel had really been told. They were eager to explain how, in their mind, what they were trying to do to keep everybody safe nonetheless went this other direction. And that was actually, I think, helpful for them to then see that get turned into something useful as well. And the department certainly had its use of force reports and the whole process that they went through. So that wasn't ignored. It was just that this was added in ways that were constructive for the community. So, Paige, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I hope I delivered that fairly.
I think you did a great job of kind of summarizing. I think, as you pointed out, we have a large and diverse workforce, and they're going to have a varied response to something like a Sentinel event review. Unless we're voting on like a salary raise, you're unlikely to get 100% consensus on anything. But I do think that there were some positives that came out of the Sentinel event review from the perspective of the rank and file. As you pointed out, John, that they were listened to. And that was, I think, a really important aspect of this review. It was a voluntary, they voluntarily participated, and they could share their perspectives. And it's important to remember that, just because they were there doesn't necessarily mean that they had all the information about everything that was going on. And so in the course of this review, they learned information about what actually transpired. They understood the decision-making processes of the people around them. And in the course of that, information dispels rumors, it dispels misinformation. A report was written that with some detail, captured what transpired so that years later, you don't have an oral historian kind of taking liberties with what actually transpired. So I think that's important. And then also, I think importantly in our review, there was a lot of discussion around the decision-making of formal leaders in the agency, of commanding officers. And officers often feel like they are held accountable for their decision-making. But there's sometimes there's concerns that there's gaps. And so I think they appreciated hearing from their supervisors what their supervisors were thinking, and the decision-making behind some of the decisions that were made. So I think that was a real positive. And the rank and file definitely appreciated hearing that information.
I would just,
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
well, I was just going to say that John articulated this before we began the Sentinel event review, and I was a captain at the time working for Paige as the field commander, and so we articulated in the field, we articulated to staff really that this is not about whether an individual use of force decision was justified. It was not about whether a commander was justified in the decision to disperse tear gas. That's not what this is about. And we just kept going over and over again with that. And I think that did finally sink in with people because, again, as I said in the beginning, we're very used to adversarial process. We're very used to use of force reviews. This is something different. We're coming into this agreeing that while we welcome First Amendment rights to assemble, and we think this is a core principle of our country, when we have looting and violence, that's something that went awry. Much like if you have an officer involved shooting, you're not saying whether or not the shooting is justified. You're saying this is a horrific outcome for the criminal justice system. And so again, that difference and that distinction really needs to be continually articulated, particularly to officers, because we're just not used to it. They're like, yeah, you're saying that, but I think you want to get me in trouble for my use of force decision. So it's an important distinction.
And Alex, just to flesh this out a little bit more, Karin, maybe you could talk about the OPA reports that we used when we weren't talking to the officers directly in that review and how that was for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an academic, so I love data. So more reports, the better. Yay. So the Office of Police Accountability generate their own reports because they are concerned with discipline and they are concerned with determining if there's misconduct or not. And so they had their own kind of fact gathering and talking to officers and interviewing officers and collecting facts about what the officer was confronting at the moment of the precipitating incident. And so we could use that was actually a source of data for our discussions. So first of all, we didn't have to recreate any wheels. And second of all, it's evidence that there's literally a separate conduct thing happening at the same time that we are doing our work. So those reports were very useful. And when we couldn't talk to the officer, or even if the officer was in the room, to have the perspective of other officers at the same time, very helpful to have that source of information, rich source of information to see not only kind of what was happening, but also how the current structure, like the accountability structure, was seeing the same event. And that actually informed our recommendations. So we were able to see, like, these are the types of questions that are asked, these are the facts that are gathered, but what that line of thought is missing is this whole other context. And so again, like, the strength of the SCR is to offer so many more viewpoints and a more holistic accounting of an event than you would get from just a disciplinary procedure, which again, like, not in conflict, at least in Seattle, they were kind of running on parallel tracks, but we could use that information to inform our discussion and to inform our recommendations.
Great. Now, I want to talk about this issue of the community involvement. I mean, when you're talking about, review of the policing of demonstrations, obviously there's a broad community that's directly impacted and you want to hear from them in terms of the events. But I think let's, take an individual shooting type incident. What is the appropriate role for community participation here? Is it just about those directly affected, or is it about obtaining a broader community perspective? And what does that contribute to the process?
So, I think it was mentioned earlier on that Paige said it very well, that two people can watch the same video and come to dramatically different conclusions of what they think has happened there. I'm struck in our event reviews that are particularly the ones that are, you could take the reviews that they participated in, and each of those gets broken down into an individual use of force, and we just had a string of them over 180 days. But for each one of those uses of force, I'm often struck by how often the criminal justice side of things says, well, we're enforcing the law, and the community says, well, we want you to keep us safe. And those are overlapping but not identical Venn diagrams, right? And so I think it's really important. The police department is being judged by the standards of the community, and they may not always know exactly what those standards really are. And the community looks and interprets police behaviors, but they may not always know exactly why the police have designed their protocols and procedures to be the way they are. And when you can create an opportunity to have those conversations, especially when you've built the trust of, we're really going to listen, we're really going to consider this before we come to a conclusion about what we think the right thing to do is, and then we're going to do that as a group, you really build, I think, more effective, you inform the police with more effective tools, and the community feels heard and understood, and you can make real progress there. We had an incident in Tucson, a death in custody there, that we looked at, and the community saw a much more negative and much more sort of structurally racist result than the police had either intended or understood even watching the video. And so we ended that with the assistant chief saying, I have a much better idea of the test that I'm being graded on, right? Because the test I was studying for was not the test I'm being graded on by the community in a sense. And we had the community members saying, this really humanized the police for me in a way that lets me go back to the community and say, this is what I think we can do with this. So that's my take on it. But again, I'll turn it over to the rest of the group, and Mac, I'm sure, has perspectives on this as well from what he's done.
Can I get on my soapbox for a moment?
Yeah, please.
To this question, because I think, yes, I think people who are involved, literally involved, directly involved, ideally would be in the room. I think another concentric circle, or for example, like business owners who maybe weren't at the protest, but their property certainly was and may have been damaged or may have been implicated in some way. That makes sense to me. But I also think it's a really important aspect of the SCR is that the criminal legal system is operating in all of our names. It is a public institution. It is there for and by us. And so this is a way that really becomes concrete, that even if you weren't personally present at whatever the event was, you're still affected by it because the criminal legal system is operating for and with you, ideally. And so it's a way of kind of putting into practice and making very concrete what can be abstract. Like protect and serve. It's great logo, great slogan, but what does it actually mean? And so this is a way for people to actually experience what that means. So I guess getting to your question, like who should be there, I think many different strata ideally of community would be there, like directly involved, maybe peripherally involved, and then even if you weren't involved, to still have a voice and to still see what the criminal legal system, what police are doing for you or in your name. And as John was saying, like for everybody to learn from other perspectives and to see to what test are we giving ourselves and are we studying for the right one?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think that what I really like about this framework is that it asks of management in the police department to define the end zone. And from your football analogy, is that the goal is for folks not to be killed by the police. And there is this assumption that goes into the conversation of, yeah, of course we don't want this, but like celebrating that. I think about the Richmond Police Department used to have a parade every year that there were no shootings by police. And actually messaging to the community that that's critically important and that it is a public health failure when that does occur, whether or not there's going to be blame assigned. It's really important. And I also can't help but think there several former NYPD folks have written about this, but I like the phrase, the 50% of the job that kills you is the job itself. It is the bureaucracy of the job. It is the punishment. It is the punishment in the process. And having a process that is built on having a meaningful outcome, I think is really critical. When I look at officer attitudes toward civilian oversight, and particularly the CCRB in New York, I think that from the moment that an officer is told about the CCRB, they are told internally that it is a relatively meaningless endeavor that might get them in trouble. And the sense that it might lead to better health outcomes and better outcomes from the community is not built into the infrastructure of the department. So whether it's through oversight or through this process, I think really grounding that in like we're trying to create better conditions for officers, for community members, and have less harm is a critical component missing from oversight more broadly a lot of the time.
Matt and Paige, you have anything to add about the community contribution to the process you had there in Madison?
Well, I think, one salient point that I took away was, again, kind of this concept of how we can view the same images, but take away different information. And I think, looking back on our review process, one of those instances was a situation where 5 or 6 officers took into custody an individual. We learned from the community perspective that the presence of 5 or 6 officers was perhaps being, interpreted as the police were ganging up 5 to 6 people on one in an attempt to, really as a power display and to make things unfair. And it was interesting because from a police perspective, we were thinking how much safer it is for the individual when there are many of us there to be able to control this person with a reduced level of force, as opposed to a one-on-one type of environment. And so just having those discussions, I think was beneficial, as was earlier explained, about like what test are we being graded on, and to know how some of the things that we as police officers, how our training creates a bit of an echo chamber for us, and we don't recognize how at times, the large presence of officers can be not considered a positive thing in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Paige. I think just the different perspectives of the video, and one thing, I guess I'll be a little bit vulnerable here. Just the how language as well, and not just seeing images, but how differently we can hear language. And so we had an incident where someone was arrested. It was just to cut to the chase of it, but the explaining is like, well, this person was resisting, and I guess it's almost embarrassing to say now because I've kind of learned so much, but just how triggering in certain communities the mere explanation that the person was being arrested for resisting with no further explanation, and how just learning from the community really what that meant and how that felt. And again, like I said, it's a little embarrassing now in 2026 to say like, hey, like, yeah, they're being arrested for resisting. What's the problem there? But just like hearing people in the community, what that meant to them, has really was profound. And I think that has echoed through our organization, just trying to get more intentional with how we do procedural justice and explaining what we're doing. But a lot of this, I think, has roots back in going through this Sentinel event review process.
So I have another question for Paige and Matt, and that is, can you give us a feel for any policy changes that resulted from the process, and what kind of efforts you've made to track the progress or impact of those policy changes?
I can start with the policy. So it's and I think John mentioned this. There was 69 recommendations, and I think it's really key if you go down this process to be able to have decision makers in the room. So I was a captain at the time. Paige was the assistant chief and the incident commander for most of this. So we were able to these were consensus recommendations. So it was stuff by the mere fact that we were making the recommendations, we were agreeing that we wanted to move forward with these, or we wouldn't have made them. And so the few that we haven't adopted are really just for more budgetary reasons. And that was one of the things also that John and his team articulated. They're going to make recommendations and not take into account budget. So there's just some things that we haven't been able to do from a financial perspective, but we have adopted almost all of the 69 recommendations. And so, and the way we've gone about that is we just completely revamped our demonstrations and assembly SOP, and just indoctrinated everything within that SOP and within training. And so, I think the really critical, and there's a lot, there's all sorts of change. There's 69 recommendations that are in policy, so I'm not going to go through and list all of those. But I think that the piece that I keep coming back to is that we created these community dialogue teams, which were just special officers within a group of officers within our special events team, which is our crowd management team, to work on communicating, connecting with event organizers. And so that's played out, and it's just continued to bolster that team of officers. And like what currently is going on here is obviously concerns about ICE and immigration enforcement. And so that same group of community dialogue teams has put together presentations to get out to the community in Spanish and English, and they're going to we have 6 different precincts. They're going, to within the different precincts, trying to get that message out. So I think it's just, that's a spin-off of this, but it's just that greater connection with the community. And then also we have community police advisory boards, so like diverse community boards that were within each of the district. I really think that's a spin-off of Sentinel Event Review. It's just trying to continue to build these relationships outside of crisis. I mean, some of this isn't new, but I think really putting it on paper and making sure you're doing it instead of just saying, "Oh yeah, we do that. We're connected to the community." That's not really enough. It's having these very intentional points in which you do that. So
Great, thank you. Karin, I have a question for you. Often for the community, we've heard the primary demand be couched in terms of, things like officer discipline and who's going to get punished for this outcome that we're unhappy about. And so I'm curious about if you experience in Seattle some resistance at the community level to creating some kind of a new process that wasn't focused on punishment.
I mean, it's Seattle. So we do have a culture where we like to talk through things. There's kind of a consensus and transparency aspect of the culture in Seattle that I think is different from other states. I'm speaking from my experience in California and New York. So I will say that culturally, there's a certain kind of openness that may not be in other jurisdictions. And certainly some people were certainly resistant to that idea, but I do think there's something powerful about being invited to the table with people every rank of SPD that I think alleviated some of that concern and like that kind of impetus to just like want to see punishment and want to see discipline. That the fact that people felt like there's this urge to actually understand people's experience, I think was a good counterbalance to that original impetus. So my experience and what I observed through the process of the SCR was that was not really that dominant. Or if it was, it kind of diminished rather quickly once people saw we're actually all kind of in it to win it together. We took very seriously building trust. We took very seriously the process. We took very seriously hearing from everybody. Actually pretty exhaustively. Like we extended the timeline to accommodate hearing from everybody and to coming to kind of common understanding. So I would say that like that impetus may have been there at the beginning, but quickly dissipated, at least from my observation.
When you talk about building trust, are there typically confidentiality agreements for the participants in these? And was there an issue with like ongoing media interest, coverage, and also protest activity tied to the underlying events?
I feel like, John, you should go first on this one.
Okay. So the way we've done SERs, we've never been supported in doing these with any legislation. There's never been anything that makes this anything other than a voluntary exercise for everybody involved. And then you operate under whatever the kind of Sunshine or Public Records Acts are of the jurisdiction that you're in. So what we do want to do is we want to give people time to be we want to give the ability for people to be honest with one another. We want to have the time for people to listen to one another, and we want to give time for people to have the opportunity to change their minds. Right? Everybody comes into these reviews with their existing set of beliefs and expectations, and what we hope is that in that process of reaching consensus, everybody will probably learn things and view things a little bit differently. So we try to create environments that are shared confidentiality, but we don't really have a way to enforce it. It's not like we're going to sue people who violate that trust. What we find is that when people have the opportunity to really learn what's going on in these situations, they elect that trust with one another. They elect to say, we're going to wait until we have a report. And by the way, our reports are not gotcha exercises. We don't put names personal names in the reports. These are learning exercises, safety exercises. And so we'll talk about the roles that participated in an event where we're describing it, but not people's names. And then we'll talk about how we empower those roles to get better outcomes going forward. And so we have norms that we agree to as a group. And, then public records requests get filed, and sometimes those things happen, and information that is supposed to go out as part of the transparency does. Many of those things are true of the underlying events and the documentation about those events already. And so we do have confidentiality, but again, it's not like it's litigated. It's agreed upon, and people honor it because it's the way to get where you need to go. And if media comes in, our hope is that nobody will talk to the media until we all know what we believe, and then the report can be the primary way of doing that. And underlying documents are then available according to whatever the Sunshine Act is in New York, for example.
I'll just add too that there's really something about the trust building that happen. There's a science to like how trust is built. And what I observed in the SER was that it's, these mutual exchanges of something of value. And in this case, it was mutual exchanges of valuable information that, maybe started small and then got big. And so that took the shape of, for people who are like interested in like, what are we actually talking about here? Take the shape of like an officer saying, oh yeah, like I wish I hadn't have cussed at that moment because I could see how that came across as disrespectful. Or a protester being like, oh, I can see how like us shouting that close to the faces of the officers across the barricade could make somebody feel like they were being disrespected. So like these little kind of acknowledgments of how people's behavior may have escalated or may have been a contributing factor. That's what I saw, that people were like, oh, okay, like you're able to see what you yourself did or somebody who's like on your team did and how that might have contributed. I can then, that open space for me to think about, reflect how somebody who either I or somebody who I would who I identify as being kind of in the same category as behaved. And so I saw that incremental trust build over time, that by the end people were able to say and kind of make sweeping statements like, yes, SPD does this, or activists do this, or members of the public do this, in a way that people could understand that was coming from a place of wanting to understand, wanting to be honest, and wanting to take responsibility. And again, this circling back, like that's how I see actual accountability happening, is that people seeing their own role and then making decisions to behave differently in the future.
Great. I have a question for Mac. We have these two different oversight agencies. Oh, and I meant to mention that we have turned the chat on. If you would like to post a question in the chat, we're going to get to those in just a second. Mac, so we have the Civilian Complaint Review Board, which looks at acts of individual misconduct. And then we have the Inspector General's office, which is already supposed to be looking at pattern and practice. Do we need a new institution here? And if so, how should it relate to those existing institutions?
Thanks, Alex. The first thought is that the CCRB is not positioned to be doing this work. Is that if you're the entity that historically, first of all, has bad blood with a lot of folks and not a tremendous trust, but also is conducting these individual investigations and misconduct, I think that there's a conflict of interest in where you're coming from to a certain extent, despite my experience in Oakland. I think that the IG's office, as some folks here are aware, is down from 43 staff to maybe 1 right now under the Adams administration. So, but in that way, it does give it a huge opportunity to rebuild with a new vision of what it does. So that would be the first and obvious option. There's already systemic investigations. They're not disciplinary by nature, and you could build that out. I would foresee any attempt to build this into the infrastructure of the city outside of the IG's office taking many years because of whatever you'd have to get done in city council or a ballot initiative, et cetera. So that's the first option. I think for me, it's very important that oversight be involved early on, because the challenge, I would imagine, in New York is a question of credibility. Is the department going to be fully transparent, especially after the issues in the Adams administration? Is the department going to be transparent about the outcomes, about the recommendations, about the implementation process. The NYPD changes its policies regularly without any public fanfare or without even publicly announcing it. So I think if you have an independent arbiter, it'll create more credibility for the community, and also it will be a helpful voice for the department to be able to say, all right, we're working with say the IG's office, and the IG's office can message that back. Hey, they implemented this, they implemented that. And I think my experience with oversight has been there's, and especially in New York, is there's, for the rank and file officers, a certain paranoia that any process paralleling this, mediation, a group circle to discuss an issue, is going to be woven into a disciplinary process for bad faith reasons. There's just a union expectation of that. So whatever you can do to create independence and a guarantee that this is not going to spin off into a disciplinary investigation necessarily, the more successful it could be. And I think the IG's office is pretty well positioned for that.
While we're waiting to see if we get a couple more questions in the chat, if we're talking about like some core policy issues, there are implications not just for the police departments, but also for the political leadership of these cities. Was there some difficulty in convincing political leaders to undertake such an investigation? And were there policies that really spoke to the level of like the mayor's office, not just the police department?
So I think that varies jurisdiction by jurisdiction. But again, I think it's often viewed by political leadership in a jurisdiction that the opportunity to say to the community, we are being responsible and thoughtful in our approach to this, and we're not just going to sweep this under the rug. We're actually going to try to learn together how to build these bridges back and how to prevent the next thing from happening. I always encourage the agencies that participate in our event reviews to come together and kind of take a victory lap, because we don't always collaborate on these things the way we could. And I think it is a politically brave and thoughtful act to do so. In Tucson, where we had the 2 deaths in custodies, there was a representative from City Council at the participating in the review. I know that the mayor in Madison was actively kind of looking over our shoulder is probably the way I would put it. And Paige and Madison has a uniquely named city council. I'm blanking on the name now, but we worked with them to talk about a number of issues and how to publicize it. Several government agencies were involved in Seattle. So there's different degrees of involvement that one could do. But certainly there's been support from the highest levels of administrations in many of the jurisdictions to then let the agencies that participated in the event do this important work and then make sure it gets disseminated. And that's useful too for the implementation. As Matt said, our approach in designing recommendations is we're going to try to make the world safer. And we're going to let the budget people figure out how to pay for it, right? We don't know the inner workings of the budget, and so we're going to say this is what we think ought to be done, and then turn it over to the budget. And having whatever your jurisdiction's equivalent of city council or the mayor's office or whatever it might be, understand how this process was reached can only be helpful in my view when you get to budget time.
Anyone have anything to add to that getting at the level of the politics of these things? Okay.
I
Yeah,
I did
Matt.
have one question for John and everyone else so twofold. It seems like this would be very useful as a politician to be able to point to. We've seen in New York, even in the last few months, there have been shootings where the messaging is challenged by the absence of a process that is designed to prevent this from happening moving forward. Have you seen that really fully embraced by like the main elected political leader? And then two, I just wanted to jump back to the transparency issues. I know in California, I would imagine there's a huge issue implementing this because of the state law that prevents disclosure of ongoing administrative investigations. Have you bumped into that and ever had to just not do this process in a given state?
Well, let me answer that kind of technical legal question, then I'll turn it over to Paige, Matt, and Karin on the political side. One of the things that is an advantage if you're doing this in a hospital or the NTSB is they actually have a legislative safe harbor. And the legislative safe harbor is that during the investigation, like all of the administrative, all the accountability things, the litigation, the disciplinary reviews, you go ahead and sue, you can get your depositions done, you can do all the discovery you want on your own time, but what we're doing as a safety exercise is protected until we publish the report, and then the report is public, right? So that's a huge benefit, I think, in those environments that we don't operate with in criminal justice. And so again, it's the parallel nature of it means that it's not that we're not doing the sort of backward-looking accountability stuff. It just creates the safety for everybody to know that they can speak freely in this context as well. And then when the report comes out, we've got our learnings. And so the Inspector General in New York may have certain abilities to do that while an investigation's going on. And I think that could be a real benefit to the process. We've been successful without it, but it definitely makes things more challenging, right? In terms of voluntary participation is what I would say. So that's my take on it, and I'll let the folks who have had to deal with the politicians more than I have talk about what that's like.
I mean, I didn't have to. Oh, go ahead.
I'll just say, I think, I think the heart of anyone who's running a city or an elected official is to make sure that the services are being delivered to their constituents in a efficient and meaningful, productive, lawful, and ethical way. And I think a Sentinel event review assists in all those accounts in creating an environment that's going to improve service delivery. So I think my experience was that the Sentinel event review was embraced as a way to try to move along the lines of continuous improvement. How do we get better doing what we're sworn to do?
That was my experience as well, was that there's generally kind of political support from the elected officials because this was an effort towards learning and improving.
So we have some questions in the chat. Now, there was a question about ICE. Now, my sense, of course, if the major stakeholder is unwilling to participate, then that's obviously a big problem. But what if it's a less central stakeholder? How do you determine like what the boundaries are for whether or not a review can go forward when not quite everyone is willing to come to the table?
So I think, ideally you would have every agency that participated in an event around the table. And when we did this, I don't know if it was Paige or Matt who said this, but I think we had 5 law enforcement agencies that participated. We had, the Madison Police, we had the University of Wisconsin Police, we had the Wisconsin State Police, we had the Capitol Police, right? And we'll often have EMS or dispatch, 911 dispatch involved if that's a separate agency. When we do wrongful convictions, we've got prosecutors, defense attorneys, courts, right? We've done reviews where not everybody participates, and we've still gotten lots of learnings. But the more people, the more you know about the interactions among everybody that's participating, the better your contributing factors, and therefore the better your recommendations are going to be. In an ICE setting, if we're going to be that specific, you're looking to affect and modify the way ICE does things. I think the two things you do need to have the protagonist agency, the main agency participating. You also have to agree on what the error is. And because if you don't agree on what the error is, you're going to be solving for different problems. And so, I think we haven't had any interactions with ICE. I think it's, in my mind, certainly the events, the 2 U.S. citizens that were killed in Minneapolis and many other uses of force would all be great for this event review. And certainly if ICE were interested in participating, I'd love to take a crack at that and see what we could learn, because I think we could do a lot of good there. But I do think in that context, yeah, they would probably need to be at the table.
All right. We had a question about, collective bargaining agreements that lay out the terms for discipline, et cetera. Has that been an impediment in cases?
So it really hasn't been. And again, we worked with Madison. They kind of came to us and they said, "Hey, we've got this union. It might prevent people from participating." And we said, "Let us talk to them, right? Let us make our pitch. And if the officers want to participate, great. And if the officers don't want to participate, then we'll do what we can. We think it'll be better if we have the officers' voices, and we'd like the chance to sell our product, if you will, and see if they are buyers." And 65 of them were. Not all of them were. And we got great value and great contributions and great knowledge from their participation. And so, again, I think in Seattle, and when we did it, we didn't get to talk to the officers, and that was fine. But we did have the interviews of the officers that were redacted, so we didn't necessarily know their names, but we knew the events that it disclosed, and we knew the officers' explanation of why they did what they did. And I think that's really the key: is you want the quarterback's perspective of why that was the pass he wanted to throw. And as long as you have that, whether it's a direct interview or some other written document or whatever it may be, then you've really got a rich and unique set of data to work on.
So, John, how do you think about concrete, positive, long-term outcomes of this process, and have you put in place some mechanisms for measuring that?
So ideally, we're going to win because we don't have that data, right? Ideally, these things don't happen again, and that's where you're going to get to go. I mean, we're doing this so far. It's been done episodically and not really systemically. And so it's hard for me to say, I can't point to nationwide drops in officer-involved shootings from the jurisdictions where we've done this on a one-off basis. I think what you've heard Paige and Matt say, and Karin, I'm interested in your views on this too, is like they've changed the way they approach protests. And so maybe you guys have examples of situations or scenarios where it might have gone one way, and now because we do it differently, you perceive it goes another way. But it's kind of hard to prove that negative.
So Jordan has something in the chat and I'll just read it because it's kind of involved here. It seems that part of the appeal of SER to police departments is a reframe that depersonalizes the issue and shifts the emphasis to structural factors. As potentially constructive as this can be, how is harm and impact rather than intent allowed to remain part of the conversation?
Can I please answer this question?
Please.
Because it resonates with me deeply as somebody who was driven, I mean, intellectual academic interest, yes, but like the harm is real. And so it is like so much about the harm, like to the point that it can be uncomfortable for everybody in the room. So my experience with SDR is it absolutely did not say like, okay, like it's just structural, you're fine, SPD, let's just think about what you meant to do. It doesn't really matter what you did do. I mean, that's why we're here, but it was not that at all. It was definitely like, not only does your intent matter, but the fact that this harm and impact occurred and it shouldn't have occurred was the motivating factor for people in the room. And we really aired it. I mean, it was definitely front and center a lot of the time for everybody to understand exactly, not just like, was there harm, was there impact, but like, what was the types of harm? What was the extent of the impact? Who was harmed? Was it a person? Was it a group of people? Was it a community of people that even if they weren't there because of the history were experienced this harm again? So I would actually like the reframe to me was less like depersonalizing it or focusing on intent and more on let's be real about the type of harm and impact that happened. Let's really go in there and figure out what the boundaries of that were, and then let's really focus on how to prevent that harm and impact from happening. So I'd say like the reframe is more that it's not about individual blame, but that is separate from whether or not it was about harm and impact. So I would just separate those two. It was definitely about harm and impact without being about blame.
Great. Uh, have any good lawful police shootings been reviewed? Where I guess part of that question is where there was already a determination.
Yeah, and the short answer is yes. And actually, I would say to folks in New York, if you wanted to do this, I would start there. I would take one that maybe the situation that Mac described, where the officers were deemed to have acted in ways that were within policy and protocol, but we still don't want the outcome, right? And we don't have the specter of blame over it. When we did the event review in Tucson, we had two separate deaths in custody involving Latino men within about a month of each other. And in one, the administrative review had deemed that the officers did everything they were supposed to do in accordance with their training, in accordance with protocols, and we still got the bad result. And the other, the officers had deviated and they were already on administrative leave moving towards the firing process when we came in to do our event review. And so we had those situations in parallel, and the community participants got to see each of those and why the department had made those decisions. And so, again, process, we just don't want our officers to be in those situations. We don't want our community members to be in those situations. And so yeah, we've absolutely done both ways.
I mean, I think it would be interesting for New York to go back and pick a handful of cases involving a response to a mental health crisis call where a shooting resulted. And again, not to apportion individual blame, but to try to figure out as a group what kinds of policies might be changed to try to reduce the frequency of these kinds of adverse outcomes.
We're the Quattrone Center, and we're here to help.
So I did want to ask you that. So your shop is set up to field requests from agencies, from cities who are interested in trying to pursue this. Do these cities and agencies need to bring their own funding to do this properly, or are you tapped into resources that are able to support this?
So, yes. In certain situations, we have funding that might be applicable. It kind of depends on the kind of case that we're looking at. And in certain situations, we would ask that the jurisdiction work with us to make sure that we can manage that in a professional way. I think the data on the amount of money that the city of New York is spending in civil rights claims, and they're certainly not alone as a large city in this, but these numbers go to the hundreds of millions of dollars in the biggest cities in the United States. Chicago's is huge and Philadelphia's is huge. And a Sentinel event review that might prevent the next $15 million civil rights verdict could be done for a much, 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 much smaller amount. I mean, I'd be happy to just take 10 million.
Well, and the NYPD, after the stop and frisk case, created a risk compliance office. And I thought, oh, this is great. They're going to look at adverse litigation outcomes and use that to adjust policy going forward. That's like a very straight kind of outcomes assessment type feedback loop. But when I met with them, it turns out all they were doing was ticking the boxes to comply with the agreement in the litigation. And it wasn't feeding back into real policy changes. So is there a place for police departments to really create that kind of an office and to participate in Sentinel event reviews as part of that process?
Well, I think Paige and Matt and their leadership has done that, right? I mean, they voluntarily generated this 1 year look back that said, here's our 69 recommendations for change. They fall into 3 categories: done, in process, or need external help to do. And they published it, right? So they really took that on themselves. Tucson did something similar. And I think that's an extraordinary, act of leadership and transparency, and it's the way our agencies ought to work. So it sounded like, Mac was frustrated by that too, that how do we take the things that we really are learning and put them into practice? So I don't want to minimize the difficulty of that by any means, but yeah, it can be done, and we've got examples of it.
Right. Any last questions among the panelists?
I'd just like to add, to the extent that this type of conversation was going on in Oakland, um, that's borne out in the civil lawsuit numbers for the city. Civil lawsuits against the Oakland Police Department collapsed once they created an oversight system that was integrated into having conversations with the department about the outcomes of investigations. It's a huge, it's like an 80% drop. It's truly stunning. It's not exactly this, but I would ground much of that decline in those conversations that were taking place, as opposed to just the discipline that could be administered by the oversight entity. They pair, but it's really meaningful because when you have it for 10 years, as has been the case, you have officers come up through the department being subject to those reviews and then joining leadership with a vision for how things should be corrected, as opposed to, as you pointed out, Alex, checking the box. So very exciting.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this important and somewhat, introductory conversation about a public policy intervention that I think is not something that people are very familiar with. So my hope in New York City is that we can continue this conversation and see if it could contribute to better overall outcomes in how we produce public safety. So I want to thank the audience for showing up, but especially the panelists for sharing their time with us. We have recorded today's session and we'll make it available to everyone. And we will let everyone know about the date for our next briefing, which will be in April, which will be on the topic of gang suppression policing, featuring Erica Ford, who's a leader in the community anti-violence movement here in New York City, Obi Afriye from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Babe Howell, who does work on conspiracy prosecutions as a faculty member at the CUNY Law School. So thanks again, everyone, for coming, and we'll hope to see you at our next briefing.